And unfortunately, we've reduced culture also to some shibboleths. We talk about culture as food, culture as some kind of language, some kind of nice fantasy around dialects, nice sort of exoticization around dresses. But that is just the externality of culture. There is a deeper principle to culture. And the deeper principle to culture is about what is a meaningful life. What are the actions that govern the everyday life of a society? Let me begin with a recent incident that was a moment of epiphany for me, because it taught me everything that I thought I understood about Dharma, but till that insight sort of gathered, it didn't come together the way it did when I saw this. I think about 3 months ago now, or maybe 2.5 months ago, all of us were witness to a ghastly train accident in Balasore, Odisha. About maybe 5, maximum 10 minutes, the entire train came tumbling down, and extraordinary loss of life. And you just can imagine something like that shocks the very fundamentals that you believe in. If life is so transient, it is so unpredictable, what are we talking about in terms of social change? Because this can be snuffed out any minute. So there was this moment of national tragedy, and obviously a bit of mourning and concern and just imagination. I'm sure for everyone who followed that news, it must have sparked the thought about our fundamental existence. And sometimes these moments clarify your purpose. Sometimes they cloud your judgment. But for the latter, when the judgment is clouded, when we are falling into something of a meaninglessness kind of existence, I'd urge you to look at what happened 11 days later. 11 days later, at the same site where the accident occurred, people from the nearby villages, we don't know the number, we don't know the details of what those villages were, but there was this news article carried out in all the leading newspapers that people came together and they offered Pitru Runa, they offered what we call the Shraddh, and that ritual is a day-long ritual. And during the course of that ritual, they tortured their heads, they offered their prayers, they gave sacrifices, and they prayed for the souls or for the atmas of people who depart. Now, this movement is very poignant. It is a news item at the end of the day. But come to think of it, there was no state mandate for them to do that. There was no market incentive for people to come together organically. If we were to place ourselves in that situation, how many of us can reasonably claim that an idea like that would even enter our consciousness? How many of us can claim that when such an idea comes, we actually follow through? How many of us can actually say that we follow through and we are okay with the prospect of not having our hair for 2-3 months after having offered for somebody that we have never met, somebody that we don't even know? But what is that thing? What is that impulse? Collective impulse, not just an individual impulse, not just a moment of inspiration, not just a transient emotion, but a collective conviction, a collective impulse, a collective action that propelled people to organically come together, regulate themselves, sacrifice their own happiness, sacrifice their idea of themselves for a while, and offer that oblation to somebody that they've never met. Now, if you start unpacking this, if you start understanding this, you get to the kernel of what we call the Bharatiya culture, or the idea of Dharma. Dharma, as Kapil Kapoorji is fond of saying, and I'm fond of repeating, is the one-word unwritten constitution that our nation has had for over 5,000 years. Maybe well over that, but at least 5,000 years. This is one word. I'm sitting here in the southern part of India today. I travel all over India for my work now. Wherever I go, if I say Dharma, it is registered the same way. If I say Karma, it is registered the same way. If I say Runa, it is registered the same way. Now, this is magic. This is an absolute wonder that across the length and breadth of such a vast land, and we are never tired of talking about our diversity, and across such space-time continuum, we're talking about 5,000 years and we're talking about 2,000 by 1,800 square kilometers. You have these ideas that have been registered, internalized, transmitted, lived the same way. And this is getting, this is still getting response. And this is what has actually helped those people come together on their own and offer something that is precious to them for people that they've never met. Now, if you understand this and you juxtapose this with the kind of world and the crisis that we hear about today, I mentioned in my introduction note or the title to this talk that my perspective is to look at the global crisis from an Indic Dharmic lens and see what are the prevailing thought paradigms and how can Dharma metaphysics or Dharma culture help us bridge the gap, help us show the way. We are tired of the platitude around Vishwaguru, but that's because it's been framed fairly inadequately and only politically. There is a case for Bharat as Vishwaguru. That is why the rishis have used it. Rishi Vakya is not trivial. Now, if you were to understand this, you have to unpack what is happening in the world today. What is really happening in the world today? You have a climate crisis that is there. And within that, you have all kinds of political narratives. On one hand, you have the global capitalistic logic that says that this has just been hijacked by some loony leftists, and there is really no case for concern. But that is funny in a way, because you don't have to read any theory to experience this. You can see it yourselves. You can just look at the soil quality index. You can look at the way oceans are being boiled. You can look at the data that comes from the species count and how we are going through a massive extinction. All of the science, which is verifiable, falsifiable, is telling us that there is a massive impact that we're having on environment. But the capitalistic logic, because of the cognitive dissonance that it has, if it has to contend with this, is not able to accept it. Is simply not able to say that, yes, we have a problem and that might require us to alter our lifestyles. The challenge is not so much with the technology rate, or the challenge is not so much with how we can create financial systems. The problem is that at some point, somebody's got to tell us that 10 billion people cannot have the American lifestyle, which means that you need to stop doing certain things. But the challenge is, how do you actually get comfortable in that idea of letting go? That doesn't seem to be a political problem. That doesn't seem to be a technological problem. That does not seem to be just an emotional problem. It is a cultural issue. It is an issue that has to link our personal idea of a good life with the culture that we create to cohabit and coexist with others. And that is at the nub of this issue. So we are looking at climate from that perspective. Think about war. Right? We as this decade unfolds, we are likely to see greater events of turmoil. We're already going through a fairly big, prolonged, protracted war. What was essentially started as a regional schism is now engulfing pretty much the entire Europe and with all the big powers in it. So it was never local, regardless of what the claims were when they initiated the action. It was never, the dispute might be localized. It could be about a territory within a certain geography, but it was never it was never without the interlocking of the great powers. So you see that we are also going through a war, which means that the economy is going to be impacted, which means that some of the lifestyles have to change, which means some of the essential supplies are going to be scarce, which means, again, we have to let go. Once again, we have this problem that we have a global culture and economy that runs on the idea of perennial consumption and perennial growth, but we are creating conditions that require us to let go. And this is a fundamental chasm that we have. And that leads to the kind of epidemic that you see in loneliness. You're seeing the entire mushrooming of the mental health industry. You're seeing the absolute commoditization of the human senses. And there's nothing short of this. What we're going through is really the colonization of our interiority. Colonization can happen of land, colonization can happen by control over resources, but the ultimate colonization is when your sense-making apparatus itself is colonized. And what you and I are experiencing today is this invisible but all-pervasive force which has captured the way you make sense of your own life. which has captured the interiority that you have to guide your decision making, which has captured the meaning that you give to yourself through the acts that you perform, as your life, and whether or not they are aligned to a certain external logic. Okay? So, if we were to decode the idea of multi-crisis and the role of dharma and dharmic cultures in this, if we are to look back at that behavior in that village in Odisha, where people came together on their own to do something for folks that they've never met, why did they do that? We talk about this as culture, and unfortunately, we've reduced culture also to some shibboleths. We talk about culture as food, culture as some kind of language, some kind of nice fantasy around dialects, nice sort of exoticization around dresses. But that is just the externality of culture. There is a deeper principle to culture. And the deeper principle to culture is about what is a meaningful life. What are the actions that govern the everyday life of a society? DVG says this beautifully. He says, when an object in nature is made sacred by an act of man, when an object in nature is made sacred by an act of man, that is culture. What have they done? In offering that tarpana to those that they've never met, they've actually lived their belief that there is a journey to the Atma. And for those who unfortunately experience a sudden death, sometimes in the belief of this land, in the metaphysics that governs their life, those journeys are impeded. And therefore, they took it upon themselves to facilitate the journey of that Atma to be liberated and carry on with its journey. Now, that is not provable by science. That is not verifiable in a laboratory. That is not generalizable as a theory. That is not measurable through lab experimentation. But yet, that is the truth. That is, nobody can deny the contentment those people experienced when they made an offering. Nobody can, and nobody needs to validate the kindness and joy that we experience when we do an act which is beyond ourselves. Nobody can deny the love of a mother. Nobody can, deny the experience, the subjective first-person experience that we have when we hold our own child in our hands. And yet, we have an epistemological challenge where, unless it is objectified, unless it is objective, unless it is measurable, there is a contestation around the truth claim itself. So this is the fundamental framing. You have a world that is generating crisis systematically. These are not accidental. There is a core that is generating the crisis, whether it is in oceans, whether it is in air, whether it is in soil, whether it is in your mind. There is something very fundamental that is generating this crisis. But at the same time, your means of learning, which is the human capacity, which is the only way that we can advance to actually solve the challenges that we are creating for ourselves. Your means of learning and advancing that learning for a shared understanding of life are inhibited because you have a certain epistemology that is not able to value the richness of the interior experience. And this is the fundamental challenge that we have, where we are divided internally, and those internal divisions is what we see manifesting as crisis amongst us. So if you have to challenge the notion that these are different disparate crises, if you have to, the Indian mind, particularly the Hindu metaphysics, it is a pattern-seeking mind. When faced with diversity or when faced with extraordinary complexity, it does not always go only element by element. There is a lot of empirical, rigorous thinking that Indian mind and Hindu mind has done, but there is also the ability to look at the sum total of this. That is why we get that question, what is that by knowing which that I can know everything else? So it is the ability to see things together as one and to grasp the fundamental philosophy, the essence, the tattva that has been harnessed in the Indian mind through the knowledge systems. So the case for the Dharmic culture, the case for Dharmic knowledge systems is an intellectual one as it is a moral one. It is a moral one because we are seeing the world suffer, because we've given ourselves some cruel choices. We've said that either you can have material growth or you can have spiritual abundance. Either, the choice that we've given to our young people today is that either you can chase Artha and Kama, or you can, you can have something about Dharma and Moksha. This is a fundamentally wrong setup. This is violence. we are governing our life systems through a wrong principle. And if we are to address this, you need to once again look at how knowledge is produced, how human beings learn, how we come together, and how do we engage in this conversation about what is really valuable, what is the value of value in life itself. That is the case for Dharmic culture. So if you look at this from the Western perspective today, they are talking about, they are also recognizing the chasm. They are also getting to this recognition or this acceptance and acknowledgement that the problems that they've created from a certain worldview cannot be solved by the same worldview. This is definition of madness, as Einstein said all those years ago. But they don't have an access to a lived tradition. They don't have access of something that they can mimic. They don't have the lived experience that can generate contentment. And this is the dialogue of knowledge systems that is happening in the world today. A lot of my work is in advocating the relevance of Indian knowledge systems as a system, as a compact, complete, and nourishing knowledge system that is relevant for the universe. That is why at Brhat we say Indian knowledge systems is a universal episteme. It is not a localized episteme, because the fundamental interiority, whether you are in United States or whether you are in Papua New Guinea, it is the same. We are all challenged by the same expectations and same apprehensions. So knowledge also has a universal component to it, and so does the ability to understand, accrue, and transmit knowledge. So if we were to look back at this, we have a system that is generating crisis. We don't have the dominant civilization having the means to resolve those crises that it is generating. We have a living tradition, a living civilization where pro-social behaviors, where you are able to do things for others, seems to be organically embedded into everyday life in a population of 1.3 billion. That is clearly valuable as culture, as knowledge system, as a repository of decision-making support. And now what needs to happen is this interplay where we are able to examine the strengths and weaknesses of the paradigm, but rooted and absolutely grounded and absolutely convinced, 100% convinced about the value of our intellectual and moral inheritance. Look at this and try and provide a solution for all of these things together. So a lot of work that we do at Brhat is about this rich synthesis, is about looking at this. But if you were to do this, there is an intellectual component to it. It's not just about feeling good. There is a lot of hard intellectual labor that you need to put to understand what is happening. So this requires us to unpack the priors of the Western civilization. It requires us to look at what is the historical process through which these ideas have been generated. What is the impact of these ideas on the institutions they've created and the policies that come out of those institutions and the policies that govern you and I. Now, for example, I'll take a quick example of an experience that all of us have gone through. Just 2-3 years ago, we've all gone through the horrors of COVID, and we've been locked down. We've been asked to vaccinate ourselves. There are a lot of things that are otherwise considered extraordinary, in fact, considered to be draconian. The whole debate around individual liberty, freedom, all of that has been subsumed under this, macro panic situation that all of us had. Now, within that, if we were to track that news today, I don't know how many of you tracked the evolution of that COVID debate. There is clearly an acknowledgement now that this was not a random accident. There was a very highly sophisticated, sponsored research which was sanctioned by the institutions in America, the National Institute of Health, the CDC, the FDA, all of those scientific institutions which come together for the pursuit of science in the service of humanity, as we are told, have sponsored a gain of function research for a lab in China. Interestingly, we're told that there are global rivalries between US and China, but on this research, somehow they came together. Now, this word and how words are weaponized is what I want us to get our attention to, because the process of reclaiming our position and our ability to make sense for ourselves begins with the word, begins with how we pay attention to the meaning and word association. Gain of function is a scientific term, and it is a research that is sort of sponsored, I'm told, where you're trying to understand if there is a certain act in nature which can actually help you leapfrog, right? Now, this is the explanation that was offered when there were questions raised about the origin of COVID. Very quickly, the entire scientific, technological, political establishment came down and they said this is a gain of function research. When you and I hear about this word, gain of function, we automatically in our minds register that as something valid. We register that as something that is scientific because it sounds scientific. It is coming through a scientific institution. It is coming through with the sense of authority that they know what they're speaking about. And this is the true nature of our policy making today, that whoever can claim authority and whoever has institutional hegemony is able to just generate policy for the entire world. Now, if you and I were to ask, what is the function that you're looking to gain? What is this gain? And what is the end result of this function? Then you will get a different answer. You will get an answer that this was essentially a war effort. This function that they were looking to gain on is a strategic geopolitical advantage. Now we have to then question at what point in our history, because these are all developed nations with extremely sophisticated institutions of checks and balances, at what point in history did you lose your ethics? When did you trade your scientific temper for your ethical temper? If they come back and ask India that you don't have scientific temper, if that's the stick that they choose to beat culture with, when are we going to look back at them in the eye and ask them, where is your ethical temper? Who holds the accountability for the devastation that you caused? Who holds the accountability for all the loss, the livelihood loss, the lives loss, the loss of meaning? So this is not a abstract out there issue. This is an issue that impacts you and I every single day. It is just that it takes a little bit of intellectual work to unpack all the connections between your daily life and the institutions, the policies that come out of those institutions, and the knowledge systems that provide the back thrust for those policies and for those institutions to generate culture. So that is the first thing that we need to look at. Like, what is the institutional culture? What are the fundamental axioms that are informing the philosophy of that institutional culture? Now, if you agree that this is important, if you're able to see the gap that I'm trying to paint, then you will examine the foundations of the Western civilization. And this is not about random angst. This is not about a revolution. This is just about understanding. This is about a really critical scrutiny of the ideas that are being presented as the goals for the entire world. And if you unpack that and go into a little bit of history, you notice that this entire story probably began in the 16th and 17th century. They came out of what they themselves call the Dark Ages for 600 years, because most of the Western history was a fight for power between three principal forces: the monarch, the church, and the aristocracy. And across different points in time, each of them tried to co-opt the laity or the general public. If church had sway over the general public through its religious authority for some time, then church ruled. If the monarchs had more credibility, then they were able to subsume the power of the church for some time. If the aristocrats somehow managed to gain power over these two, they were able to extract concessions, which is in fact the story of Magna Carta. If you look at from Magna Carta to what is happening in democracy even today, there is a nice compact. There is a nice trade between classes of power, right? And this is also the story of the world that animates much of the Western and by extension the entire world today. That there are there is only the material idea of history. That history is a continuous conquest for power, or history is just an evolution of financial instruments and economic technology that we've created. The question is there a different story of history? Is there a different philosophy of history? Is there a different meaning that we can give to history? And to do that, to actually understand that, you need to understand what are the fundamental ideas that this history has produced. So when the Dark Ages ended and when Renaissance and followed by Enlightenment and the whole critical flowering of their faculties has happened, we've emerged with 2 or 3 new gods. They managed to, science had decisively won over religion at that point in history in the Western world. And science erected its own gods. And those gods are what we call freedom and reason. We have to go back to the Descartesian view. I think, therefore I am. There's a whole metaphysics to it. I'm not trying to belittle In fact, he meant it in a whole systematic way. And he was also trying to get at the fundamental cognitive mechanism itself. So this attempt is not to reduce it to a comfortable, convenient narrative. But it is true at a broad level that the West emerged with the ideas of reason and freedom as the main ingredients of a global culture. And they have gathered tremendous success by deploying freedom and reason. So they gave themselves the ability to think freely, the ability to experiment, the ability to examine, the ability to conquer. And within that is embedded the core of the colonial logic, right? Because in the Hegelian spirit, if there was a progress of human thought through time, and the pinnacle of that was the European civilization at this juncture, then the moral logic that his theory gave to the rest of the Europe is that it is incumbent on them. In fact, they are burdened to give all of us that civilization, right? Now, this paradox that you have emerged out of one hegemony with the idea of reason and freedom and human spirit as the fundamental ideals of a good society. But at the same time, you somehow birthed, not just birthed, but also engendered, advanced and entrenched colonial logic using the same ideas. This shows that there is a fundamental vacuum in what the civilization has produced. And if you unpack that, then you will see the entire root cause for the crisis that we have, which appears different, but actually is just monocausal once you pare it down.